Thank you. Testing. I sound so strange on the mic. I wish I didn't have to use it. It's great to be here, and like many of you, what really drives me is how I can use technology to shape my work and to make the world a better place. So I was trained as a humanitarian designer, and now I do UX consulting. So mostly like at the intersection of like social good and technology. So as of late, my side hustle has been building chatbots. And even though I think we are moving closer to the artificial intelligence revolutionizing the world around us, I get the sense that there is something that's missing. And I think it is missing the human touch, basically. So the focus of this talk will be on chatbots from the perspective of user experience. And I've heard, like from the break, there are a lot of UX people here, so I think in good company. So as a UX consultant, I recently had the opportunity to work with Mother Coders. It's a tech training program that helps moms on-ramp to career in tech. So people with college degrees who take breaks for raising kids, they now can learn coding and programming and get a foot in the door in tech, because we are sorely in need of tech workers. Sure, you're aware of the statistics that by 2020, which is only 3 years away, that we're going to be short over 1 million tech workers. So it's a very kind of important program, and I was so honored to work with the CEO, and we also have a colleague of mine from Other Coders too, so I'm really excited that she's here. And as I started working with her, I found out that she was actually juggling 5 or 6 roles to run her, I guess, a tech nonprofit startup. And while that's not unusual, I think it's highly unsustainable. Being a mom myself, I know that moms have a lot on their plates, but this was just too much. And so I was pretty keen to try and help her out. I don't know if the animation's running, but this is a beta version of the chatbot I designed for her. So basically she asked me to revamp the website and to help her kind of rebrand the organization, but I found that she was spending a lot of time answering emails about basic questions about the organization, like with prospective students coming along and saying, how can I learn more about the program? How do I apply? When are you coming to my city? Because they're only based in San Francisco. And instead of talking to potential funders and sponsors and people that could really help scale the program, she was spending a lot of her downtime answering these emails. And so Chatbot, what I saw is a good solution to bridge that gap. And as Roger kind of alluded to us earlier, I think technology can be used to automate a lot of tasks that don't need to be managed on a daily basis. And so I think that as a UX researcher, you learn, you have a lot of opportunity to put, I guess, different resources together, because you have so much insight about the users and the people that you're working with. And my focus today will be basically outlining different techniques and strategies you can use for yourself in your companies and organizations too. I think the main paradigm shift that AI brings all boils down to when we begin to recognize common patterns from available data. So it's not even about big data. I think it should just be data. We can start to automate everyday tasks and delegate them to robots. I think technology should ultimately make our lives easier, not more complicated. So I'm Alex. My background is in architecture, and I began my career as kind of a commercial architect. And I saw this big kind of inequality in our world where designers were only catering to the top 1% of the population instead of designing for the rest of us. And so I made a kind of my life's mission to make design kind of more accessible, and that kind of essentially brought me to the US. I ran a design agency in New Zealand for about 10 years, kind of connecting designers with nonprofit organizations and doing the kind of work that I wanted to see in my community. And I think UX has a huge kind of opportunity to scale good design in a way that no other design industry can, so I'm really excited about it. But, well, staying on topic, I think we can all remember the hype that 2016 produced when Facebook released the messenger platform for bots at the F8 summit. And of course, you can say that hindsight is good 2020 vision because we now know it was a big mess. And so what they did a year later was, after realizing that their chatbots had reported a 70% failure rate, they revised their platform to reflect their actual capability, which is not very good at having conversations that people expected them to. So short of saying that we should follow their lead and give up on chatbots, I think that we have a huge opportunity here in front of us if only we knew how to design for them. So Mary Meeker, the Silicon Valley's most respected growth expert from Kleiner Perkins, she does these amazing PowerPoint presentations every year. This year, I think she had 400 slides that she went through in 30 minutes. She had some really interesting slides in her presentation, which I think are relevant to what we're talking about. So the first one being that email spam is getting more malicious. So, when I was working with Tina, her mandate for me as a designer was to help her improve the open rate of newsletters that she was sending out to potential donors so that they would maybe donate more. And I certainly helped her do that, but I think that's kind of no longer a relevant metric for us to focus on because of such an uptick in the blue area here that you see, just the amount of spam and spammers getting really good at getting through our inboxes, making it that much more difficult for organizations to disseminate relevant information. I don't think I showed you that slide when I was talking about the blue area under the graph. So there it is. That's a very powerful slide. Sorry. And the second trend is that we are spending more time online. And so contrary to what most experts are saying about how we're moving from desktop to laptop to mobile and now voice, we're actually not exchanging kind of platforms, but we're adding them onto our daily lives. So you can see that is the right graph. The additional time that we're spending, the green is the mobile and blue is laptop/desktop. We're spending more and more time online. And so, that is the reality of the digital generation we're in. And we're choosing to stay more connected at all times. The third trend that I thought was important was that now 20% of mobile queries are made via voice. So not only is it really kind of a reflection that market is shifting to voice and other types of conversational UI, but the fact that people are warming up to, this increased level of interactivity, artificial intelligence, and the fact that the quality has improved quite significantly. The fourth trend is that customer service is shifting to chat. So again, more profit for merchants. And why this is important is because chatbots give, different companies opportunities to improve, their margins. Because currently, if you are launching your apps through an app store or Play Store, Apple or Google will take 30% of the margin. But if you were to sell your merchandise through chatbots, you take 100% of the margins. And so that's why there's been such a huge kind of blow up of chatbots in the marketplace in the past year, because it just makes sense to monetize the extra 30% that you are giving to Apple or Google. But I think what it all comes down to, based on these kind of trends that we've been looking at, is that chatbot is the future interface that we're going to be dealing with. So for my presentation, I'm going to be covering kind of 3 kind of areas that I think are quite interesting. Firstly, we have to know like where we've been in order to know where to go. So the brief history of bots, the best UX practice for designing bots, and also some, I guess, illustrations of common use cases, like what works and what doesn't. So what is a bot? Can anyone in the audience like volunteer their definition of what they think a bot is?
Something that does something automated tasks.
Mm-hmm. Something that does automated tasks, something that triggers.
Something that provides an automated response based on trigger keywords.
Something that provides automated tasks based on trigger keywords. These aren't bots, these are bot experts somebody had drawn. So it's not what we were kind of thinking. So maybe a sideways dictionary. This is kind of a crowdsourced dictionary, kind of like Urban Dictionary, but for kind of hyper geeks that like to offer their definition of what bots are. So what has the hype been all about? I started to ask myself as I was exploring this new territory of conversational UI. And Amir Shivat, which I consider to be one of the foremost experts on bots in the Bay Area, he currently works for Slack. He's I think he's like the head engineer there. And he just released a book through O'Reilly called Designing Bots. It came out last month, so it's hot off the press. It's great, you should get it. And according to him, the definition is that it's just a new interface for service. So it's nothing complicated, but the fact that it's a new interface means that old rules don't apply. If you also have heard of the hype cycle that's produced by Gartner every year, which kind of tracks tracks whether new technology is meeting our expectations and whether that has been inflated or hasn't met our expectation. Bots are right up there. So right now, speaking of bots, they're at the height of inflated expectations, which means that it may also fall quite quickly. And we've kind of seen that, like through Facebook. And the other way of looking at it is to look at kind of the Google trends of like how often people search for the term chatbots. So when you search for bots, like it gives you a very irregular graph, but chatbots more specific to kind of a chat interface. And so I searched for that, and there was some quite, appointed events along the way in the last 3 years. The one in June 2014 is when the chatbot first beat the Turing test. And the Turing test is basically kind of an internationally recognized scientific examination of whether an artificial intelligence is able to beat kind of our expectation, like basically trying to fool us that it's a human being. And so they have 10 scientists behind the screen, has a conversation with this whatever artificial intelligence is behind them, and they give them a score. And so I think their baseline was like 50% pass rate, and this chatbot that was designed by a Russian engineer passed by 60%. And so this was the first peak, and then the second peak, of course, was when the Facebook launched the Messenger platform with chatbots. And then there was some drama shortly after that when Microsoft released a racist, sexist chatbot called Tai. And so there's been some definite peaks and ebbs and flows over the past year or so, but the conversations on chatbots not slowing down anytime soon. And so when we look at news media, we also have to be quite cognizant that there are two sides to every story, and to read kind of the negatives as well as the positives that are coming out. So this is kind of the screenshot of what happened to the Twitter bot Tai. It got taken down by Microsoft in about 24 hours after it was released. People from all over the world started conversations and basically trained the bot to say racist and sexist remarks. So, you know, like our expectations for bots aren't always met in reality, and when things go wrong, they can go really, really wrong. So, you know, it goes to say that human likeness does not always equate to trust, and it's, you know, kind of the digital space is where like the real versus the AR becomes even more blurred. So Microsoft took a second shot at this AI chatbot, and they renamed him Zoe, and they released it in private beta so that there wouldn't be any unexpected performances, you know, like you would out in the real world. So we have yet to see. I recently tried to have a conversation with Zoe. I resurrected her from one of the secret repositories they had, and she wasn't that fun. She was, you know, kind of a try-hard, like 12-year-old girl trying to sound cool, but didn't really meet my expectations of cool, you know, as a mom. So I guess the second, the reason why I think the bots haven't taken over the world is that maybe we've been focusing on the wrong metrics, and so people care a lot about open rates. And one of the biggest hypes about bots come from the fact that they have a 97% open rate as opposed to emails, which only have 1% open rate for like mass kind of subscription-based systems. But I think perhaps like we need to focus on other more meaningful metrics like retention and engagement as a measure for success. I think there's a lot of clickbaity marketing for bots out there, but I think focusing on the wrong metrics and user retention problems, it's, you know, it's only going to lead to disappointment. The third reality of bots as a current state is that they're not very good at holding conversation. While they're perfectly good at understanding what we're trying to say and the intents behind it through, I guess, sentiment analysis and I guess other NLP engines that exist to process like what we're meant to say with the data, but they're still not very good social creatures. But I think we also need to think about like how we take years to develop good social skills, whereas, you know, I think bots were unfortunately expected to work perfectly right out of the box from day one, thanks to all the sci-fi, you know, myths and movies that we've seen over the years. That was inevitable. So bringing back this graph that I showed you earlier on Gartner hype cycle, I think perhaps the bots have failed because it had this other equally important component, which is natural language processing. So there's some disillusionment there, and you know, I think we still have a long way to go in terms of their development capacity, and I think it's comparable to human development. So one of the interesting insights I had from someone who runs the IBM bot platform said that they're equivalent of a 2-year-old, and I have not yet a 2-year-old, a 22-month-old boy who, you know, babbles all day, makes no sense. And I think, you know, I think it's safe to say that, you know, that's where we should expect the bots to be. An unintelligible, babbling baby. And so, you know, that also got me thinking, is our president a bot? So going on to my next section of the talk, I want to talk a little bit about the best practice for bot design. And as a UX consultant, I always like to think about things from a UX lens. And so I came up with a new framework that is easier to remember, called the RUF framework. And I'll go through each of them with you. So the first letter of the RUF is reliability. I think also one of the most contested issues in bot ethics is the big red button problem. For those of you who aren't familiar with this analogy, it's a way of shutting down a rogue AI when it poses a threat to human security. So the argument goes, when the robots begin to learn on their own, They may learn to avoid such interruptions. So if they were programmed to shut itself down after 5 minutes, and they think it's in their best interest to keep the power on, they might override, I guess, human instruction and disable the red button for its own survival. And so these kind of dystopian lens that we see in sci-fi movie may become a reality if we don't, control like how we design boats and be really thoughtful about what we're building. And so, well, that's a very far-fetched scenario relative to where we are in bot development. We can use similar thinking for designing them. So if we don't want our bots to fail, and if we want them to be reliable, I think we need to really narrow down on the scope of what we want the bots to accomplish for users and design for like a number of different use cases that are very specific. One way to do this is to use segmentation to narrow down choices and to quickly tease out the behavioral patterns of users to offer more tailored experience. And so if they are reaching out to you through a Facebook, the reason why the Facebooks have been quite popular is because it already pre-populates your personal information that you put on Facebook to the bot, and they can remember that information next time it visits you, so it saves them from having to ask you really personal questions. And having done a lot of like usability testing with people, as much as they hate Facebook, it's one thing they're most familiar with and is kind of the #1 social plugin they use to log into external networks. And so that's kind of one of the benefits of going through like an existing chat platform. And then I think you have to ask yourself what your users typically want and what are the relevant experiences for each use case. And so you can go through this thing called the empathy mapping, both for your, I guess, typical personas, meaning like typical person that might be using your product or services, as well as persona study for your bot, because your bot will have a personality that will make it much easier for us to engage. And the second letter in this acronym is the usability, which is about designing with purpose and inclusivity. So I think, I've been reading a lot about like the ethical aspects of building bots, and one thing that the AI ethics advocates agree on is that bots need to understand the value of people that it's interacting with in order to offer great UX and minimize conflict. So in other words, they need to learn common sense. But how do we teach bots common sense? It seems even hard for an average person, but it means being able to listen to other people and learning it from places that we often, I guess, take for granted and least expect. So programming bots from like characters you read about in fictions, biographies, blogs. I think personally designing bots based on characters you find in books is such a great way to do it, because like you learn so much about the person in a way that you wouldn't unless you're very intimate friends. And the authors of these stories, they pour their heart and soul into a story, and they walk us through it with vivid details of, and setting the stage for a series of events that are about to come. And so I think, telling a really good story when you're developing your own bots is going to be very critical to its success. Its relatability and its ability to develop empathy with your users. The third is functionality. What kind of strategic value does your bot bring? Where can you optimize, deliver on it perfectly, and then iterate to make it work for your user? We can build bots in similar ways that we implement UX for product development. So avoiding conflict means anticipating every possible need, not just the main user flows. And so one of the reasons why bots fail so often is because people only design for the best case scenario. And so often you come across these kind of instances where there's like a 404 error, or like, I'm sorry, I didn't understand, can you please like repeat what you said, or like, press help or quit. And so I think it's really important to design for the edge cases and for your bot kind of story flows to be MECE, like mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. So I can see people are really distracted with the kittens and not paying attention to my talk, which is great. And so that brings me to kind of, the good, bad, and the ugly. I looked at so many different bots, but I was able to kind of categorize them into like 3 different, I guess, typical categories. But if you look at a lot of like databases for bots, they might say there are like 7 different categories or like 22 different categories, depending on what database you're going to. But often like people that categorize them tend to overinflate the number of like bots that actually work. So it's still not easy to find ones that work well. I'm personally interested in the nonprofit use case because I care a lot about kind of technology's ability to do a lot of social good, but there aren't very many out there. The one that is most well known is called the Do Not Pay. It's been developed by a young lad who built a robot lawyer to fight parking fines. And so far to date, he's helped over 160,000 people appeal their parking tickets. It's a remarkable, I guess, discovery that, finding a hole in the system and then trying to patch it up with a bot. I think it's a great idea. I think we should have more of it. And the site is remarkably simple to use. I think that's one of the key kind of lessons from my research on bots is that you don't need to make something so complicated, because I think that for your most successful use case, it's going to be something that needs to be easy for people to access and understand. And in this case, the bot is able to kind of break down the legalese into something that is common everyday knowledge. And so they give you like a list of, I guess, choices to select, and then, writes this letter for you, making all the kind of references to the right kind of regulations and policies that refer to why you shouldn't get a parking ticket. And so it's kind of automated, easy, simple, reliable. So it fits all the 3 kind of, I guess, categories that I mentioned earlier. So, but I guess, going back to kind of this talk about failure, I think it's important to think about what your end state is going to be with your chatbot. So not just about how it starts, how it kind of breaks the ice at the beginning, sustains the conversation, but you also have to think about the end state. What do you want your users to achieve in the end? Do you want that end state to be a redirection to a product wiki, like an external link or like an existing website, a contact form like via email, or like would you actually have a phone number available for someone to call? Like, 0 for operator, would you have something equivalent there? Or like a feedback form so people can give you feedback about, suggestions, and use the sentiment analysis to, generate, how your product is performing. And also, how can we recover from falls better? Like, there are more kind of creative ways to, I guess, recover from, like, when the bot comes across an expression it doesn't understand. And so there are some good examples where like bots are trying to use humor to like redirect people to like where it wants to go. And so I think it's quite similar to like having a conversation with someone when you reach that awkward silence. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to step away and pretend like that person wasn't there, or are you actually going to tell a joke and then bring you back kind of to the focus that you were you want to talk about. So I guess at this stage, like you can also do like an A/B testing and kind of look at your backlog after you launched the bot to ask yourself, what caused it to go wrong? Did we have the wrong data? Was there a gap in our flow? Did users actively try to break it? I think you should actively try to break anything that it comes across as a good test to see how robust it is. I think it's a good way to build trust. But most importantly, do you know your own technical limits of what your bot can or can't do? Do you want it to be completely AI-based, or is it sufficient to have one built out of a decision tree? So the bots that I've been building are very simple kind of business processing type of bots that just helps with the workflow of an organization, and so it doesn't really rely on artificial intelligence. as much as it does kind of looking manually through the customer data to make sure that we can optimize the business. So a good rule of thumb is like the 3 R's: refocus, remind, and redirect. So as I mentioned earlier, refocus your users to the purpose at hand. What do you want them to do? Remind your users. They can also trigger, I guess, users to ask kind of really random questions about like why they were there in the first place, but they might want to kind of sidetrack and talk about something else. But this is also something that you do in a normal conversation. So what would you do when you're talking to someone who suddenly like forgets what they're talking about and wants to talk about something else, but you really want to sell this product to them? And so kind of thinking like a salesperson, going door to door, and redirecting is similar to reminding them why they're there, but also providing value for them so that you're cognizant of their time. Business use cases tend to be, I guess, the most successful of all the bots that have been built, partly because, as I said, the bots built for improving business process automation, like calendars and appointments, and like bots that live through Slack are really good examples of kind of B2B bots that have been successful. This bot, Amy, manages your calendar meetings for you. So, if you think back on the slides that we showed on Mary Meeker, who pointedly said we're actually spending so much more time on different devices. Are we going to take that time away from family, or are we going to try and, take it away from our own productivity so that we can be more efficient workers? So Slack is well known for optimizing teamwork, and is of course like competing with Facebook and a few others to be one of the most popular platforms for bots. But even they recognize when there's a time and place for bots. So it's not to say, when you have a hammer and your hammer is like a bot, not everything is a nail, so you don't have to build a bot left, right, and center. And so, they did a test very early on before they launched, and became this very popular business kind of email engine. They did user testing with people to see if like they would either have a traditional landing page or have this very interactive version of the introduction to the software in which they preferred. And of course, customers to this day, they prefer a traditional landing page because that's what we're familiar with, and that's what brings them kind of most value. Because I think when you're trying to onboard new technology too quickly, it can also tend to fall flat on its face because maybe your users aren't prepared to engage with you at that level. And lastly, the B2C space, this is where you see majority of the bots living. It goes into a lot of like e-commerce and services that are trying to sell stuff to you, but it's also coming into like a lot of health and kind of, I guess, spaces where things can get pretty personal pretty quickly. And so where do we draw the line, and how far can we go? There's the elephant in the room. So here's a really cool bot. It's a therapy bot that like checks in with you every day and has these conversations. It was built by some engineers and also psychologists out of Stanford. And so they used like an actual metric to make sure that like they weren't really crossing lines and not replacing real therapists, but making it more affordable for people for whom it is like cost prohibitive to see a shrink every week. And so, what works in the bot realm, it seems to give lots of choices, flexibility, and to build trust, because it's hard to earn, but it's quickly lost. And what doesn't work is, thinking, too far outside of its scope. The other way to think about designing bots is like designing a game loop. While B2B applications have been quite successful because they have a very specific use case, which is typically very transactional, But in the B2C space, the expectations are much higher because people expect customization and high levels of personalization. So, how can we achieve this? And what do you do when there's a gap in a conversation because things are too linear? You can't really see what happened in front of you unless you scroll up. But most people don't take time to do so, and so I guess it's like a way of remembering kind of, I think Roger talked about like online learning. So every time you're interacting with a bot, it sends your information up to that date back to kind of a database where it kind of, I guess, resegments you based on like your interaction with them up to that point, and then giving you a more customized, I guess, experience. And I think that's probably going to be key to Chatbot's success moving forward. So this last quote I dug out of Amir Shavat's book on designing bots. And I think he sums it up quite nicely. He says, "The best bots will be a hybrid of text and rich interaction. They'll provide the users with delightful conversation enriched by rich controls. And great bots will provide buttons but support text responses. Will post summaries and provide links to details. We'll expect rich interaction and feedback from users and we'll add a layer of sentiment with emojis, images, and GIFs." And I hope he wasn't advertising for the movie The Emoji. So in conclusion, we still have a long way to go, and people still expect less from AI engines that are built into chatbots. So we should lower expectations, learning from Facebook's lessons, taking the chat out of chatbots. That basically means I think we should start small, understand your tools and not everything is nail. Remember intent, design with a purpose. What problem is your bot solving? Engagement, bring value to users no matter where they are. Focus on users first, give them a personality, or work on their personas, character development, and the rough framework. Make it reliable, usable, and functional. And so there you have it. So I hope I can share these slides with you because I have a ton of references for my slides in the back, so it'll be helpful. Thanks.
Send it to me, and then I'll send it out to everybody.
Okay.
Or you can even tweet it out, and I'll retweet you.
I'll tweet it out.
Anybody have any questions about? Right there. Okay.
I'll bring your mic to
Yeah.
Hi.
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 In terms of personality development, I'm wondering if there are any frameworks that you use to document the personality and then to kind of share that personality with whoever's actually implementing the bot. Like how do you communicate what kind of personality you want it to have to the developers? How do you sort of frameworkize that personality in any kind of way?
I think there are two parts to that. So when I'm building chatbots, I tend to build a proto-persona or persona for the users that for the services that we're developing for, and we try to match the personality of the bot to that of the typical users that we will be interacting. That way, they'll be more kind of relatable and easier to communicate. So the use case I gave about Zoe, the new Microsoft bot they released, it's hard to relate for me. Because I'm actually now like a generation beyond, I guess, the personality that Zoe was developed for. So for me, like, it made it super easy for me to kind of see through kind of all the, I guess, little jokes and things that she said to reveal like its own weaknesses. And so it makes it easier for your bot to fail if your bot's persona doesn't match that of your intended user. And so I think, spending a lot of time kind of figuring what that is and developing like a few different use cases for it would really help.